Hello, Parkies. Welcome, Park Advisory Council friends, park activists, folks who maybe aren't quite in the park world but stumbled upon this webinar and are curious to learn more. My name is Nicole Machuca. I'm the Director of Environmental Education and Neighborhood Parks here at Friends of the Parks. This is our 6th webinar that we have done. It's been a very long time, but I hope that the timing is just right for this one and that it will be much appreciated and you guys will learn some things. As you'll see, if you go to our YouTube page, we have 5 other webinars. I'm going to reference a couple of them and point out what the content is beyond maybe what you can figure out from the context of the titles. But this is one of the things that we do here at Friends of the Parks, and hopefully you'll find some great information there. But let us talk about what we are doing here today. So on Tuesday, today that I'm filming this, it's Wednesday, August 29th. So last week, Tuesday, we had our quarterly PAC, Park Advisory Council networking meeting. The topic was getting the yes to your budget request. And we had a great crew there. I talked about some ways that folks can get the yes to your budget request. So this was the content of the networking meeting. It had great feedback. I learned that not all the folks who've been around in their park advisory councils for a long time, they didn't know some of the basic budget information. So felt like with the timing of this upcoming public budget hearing that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, that this is a great time. I should probably turn the presentation that I did into a webinar. So as you see, this is, the time frame, the agenda of that meeting, but obviously we're not gonna be able to network one another, which is unfortunate. Hopefully you will do that at the September 17th public budget hearing. I'm really just going to very briefly go into the Park District's budgeting process. I'm going to talk a lot more about advocacy and what that means. And I'm going to talk about a tool that you can use to develop your own advocacy plan with your park friends, whoever that may be. Maybe it's a park advisory council. Maybe it is you're part of a group of neighbors that are having an issue and you want to organize around something. This might be the right webinar for you. So as I kind of alluded to, you maybe are hearing this for the first time, maybe you have seen it in my emails, but on September 17th of this year, the Park District is having their annual public budget hearing. And the reason why I know this is because I have seen it. I have seen it on the Board of Commissioners, their Legistar page. They have public forum September 17th at Fosco Park at 5:30. But I have not seen it on the place that I usually do, which is on the Park District's budget and management page. I find this webpage, which is a very important one, by just simply searching Chicago Park District budget. It's the first one that comes up. I'm going to reference this page a couple times. But yeah, I haven't seen it here yet. So here they still have the information for the 2018 fiscal year budget process. So I would just keep checking back here. As you can see, they had registration at 5:30 and the hearing began at 6, which is why I have it on this PowerPoint slide. Because like I said on the Board of Commissioners page, it says 5:30, but last year registration opened at 5:30. In the past 2 years, you could only register in person. And then the meeting itself began at 6 o'clock. You have 2 minutes to speak. As I recall, last year they were not very hard on folks about that, although there are a lot of people there. So many people. Great time. And I also want to reference the past couple of years. Last year, the past 2 years, the meeting has been focused on the operating budget. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute if you don't know what I'm talking about. But they heard capital requests as well. Whereas a couple of years ago, as folks were presenting, they kept saying, interrupting people, saying that they were only going to hear operating, not capital. So I'm assuming it will be like how it was last year, which I thought was really great. Gave folks a chance to say their piece about both their operating and their capital requests. So we will find out more about that soon, I am sure, as it is almost September. Oops. Yep. So what is going on right now within Park District? So the different departments are submitting their budget requests. That's including capital and operation requests. Again, we'll define that in just a minute. And then we're coming along that September 17th meeting. And then the budget team at the Park District is going to put together a preliminary budget, submit that to the superintendent, which will then go to the Park District Board of Commissioners. It'll be released to the public on that page that I just referenced. So right here you see it says 2018 budget appropriations. This is the finalized version for the 2018 fiscal year budget, but they will most likely, I'm pretty sure they're going to put a section on here that says 2019 budget proposed or something. I forget exactly what they call it. And then as it gets finalized, so like this one was finalized mid-December of 2017. Once it's finalized, then they get up the final budget on this webpage. So again, this is a really, really, really important webpage. And why that's important, oops, I'm going all the wrong ways. That it's important to know to come back to the page and find and see the proposed budget because there is another hearing that is also on the Board of Commissioners page, December 5th. Doesn't say budget on here, but I'm pretty sure. I am guessing that this is on the budget. I'm 99% sure. So I actually see, it's really interesting. Oops, I'm going all over the place. I see a lot more folks come to the September meeting and not as many come speak to the Board of Commissioners and Park District staff at the December meeting. So keep that in mind as well, that there are actually two spaces. So one, hopefully your requests are feeding into the preliminary budget, and then hopefully you're reviewing your budget and you're speaking into what you've seen. And then in mid-December, the Board of Commissioners votes on that final budget. So that is the process. And again, I told you, in case you didn't know already, I would come back to it to define what is an operating expense and what is a capital expense or operating request, operations request versus capital request. So really operating expenses, operating funds are really about personnel, supplies, equipment, really about people and materials, like here's some sports equipment. Capital expenses, the way I think about it, sometimes it is hard for me I always identify which one is which, but if you can think of infrastructure like a water fountain or air conditioning, like a large HVAC system, or playground, basketball courts. I think, as I said, HVAC, I was like, wait, is HVAC actually capital? So an example of sometimes when it's hard for me or hard for folks to know. I'm sure someone does. But yeah, so anything really related to infrastructure would fall under capital expenses. And as an example of operations budget, I pulled up the park that is closest to where I reside now on the far northwest side, and that park is Gladstone Park. So here is the budget, the 2018 final budget that was produced by Park District and put out there. So in theory, these 2018 budget items are what came through. You'll see that like in 2019, they're gonna have like 2017 actual. So sometimes like those numbers don't actually match up, right? So maybe they wanted to fill the supervisor position, but maybe your position's vacant for a while. So a neighboring supervisor has to fill in, right? So maybe that actual number of dollars allocated to the supervisor is less. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. So if you, your park may or may not have a page like this that may or may not reflect how many full-time staff you have. So like with this person, this attendant, they're a full-timer, but the way I'm interpreting this, they're split between different parks. So that's why it says 0.2. They themselves are full-time, but they're not actually at Gladstone full-time. Here you see the hourly positions. So this doesn't exactly reflect how many people are, how many hourly staff people there are at your park, but you can see how many hours they're supposed to be, the park staff are supposed to be working that are hourly. If you have a park, most of the parks that have field houses have supervisors. There are a couple of exceptions to that I can think of, at least one exception that I can think of, if not, oh, just think two. But if your park does not have a field house, you are most definitely not in this document. So I'm going to think of the other park that is close to my house that is not in, that does not have a field house, and that's Forest Glen Park. If you guys know the Elston DMV over there on the far northwest side, that is where Forest Glen Park is very near. Where is this park? I thought it was called Forest Glen. So the park that is by me does not have a field house, but I know that Gladstone Park is, oh, that's why. Okay, there we go, Forest Glen. So if I search Forest Glen, it's only coming up on this is the entire park list for the North region, but it's not coming up as another park, right? So, and the reason is because Gladstone Park is the supervising park. So that information is not reflected on here, and it's not easily found on the internet. So I can't see that my supervisor at Gladstone, that they're also in charge of, you know, stewarding, making sure that Forest Glen Park is okay. That's not reflected on this page. So if you have a park and you're not aware how to find your supervisor, there are a couple ways. You can ask me. I can certainly help you find that information. You can search Chicago Park District Regions on the Google, and that first link will pop up the different region offices, and you can give them a call. Sometimes you might think you're in the South region, but you're actually in Central. In fact, that is what this map behind me is showing. So I think that's Division. Nope, that's North Avenue. So North Avenue, and then 51st. So everything in between there is Central region, then we have North, Central, and everything below that is South. And then if you really don't know, then there's different areas as well. So that's what these different boxes are. So where was I? You could also, Park District, Gladstone. You could search your park, and then you go to the Park District's page, and it should have the supervisor's name. Like I said, Forest Glen. I should have probably searched that. So then it should say the supervisor's name and the park that they are stationed out of. So if you have questions about that, if it is, sometimes this says vacant or this doesn't actually reflect the supervisor, you can give me a call and I can communicate that to Park District that it's not reflected on the website. All right, so wanted to touch on that. Let us go back to the Gladstone page. So this document does not have capital dollars in it. There is a capital budget. but it is not itemized like this. It's a lot of text and a lot of pictures. It doesn't actually have the itemized projects for the expected projects for the year. So that is quite a challenge for a lot of groups. And as I said before, I was going to reference some of these other webinars. If you have questions, like, I talk about capital, I talk a lot more about all of those budgeting things in this second webinar video. So if there's questions that you had that I didn't get into, please check it out there. All right. So now that I've kind of just gone over the budget again, let's talk about advocacy and why you want to advocate. And in fact, I'm going to switch these around. So let's say that you're going to this budget meeting because you want more programming. You have some aspect of your park's infrastructure that you want fixed. You need more staff. You want your park open more hours. You want a dog park. I don't know. You're going to that budget meeting with a goal in mind, right? So yeah, you could just go to the budget meeting on September 17th, make your requests and wipe your hands at that and just walk away. But if you want something, there are probably going to be at like 30, 40, 50 park advisory councils there. A lot of people want something, right? So you have to think about advocating for the change that you want to bring to your park. So let's talk about advocacy, because it can be a really scary word for a lot of folks. Advocacy involves getting powerful folks to make changes that may not be in their short-term interests, right? So you want to get powerful decision makers to make changes that they maybe don't want to make. And it doesn't mean that you have to be confrontational or be nasty or mean, or that there has to be conflict, although conflict is not always terrible, right? Conflict leads to change quite often. So hopefully, right? So advocacy, again, it can be a process. So what are some examples of it? Writing a letter to Chicago Park District in support or against something, presenting testimony, organizing park folks together to take some sort of action, and I'll give some examples of these. And advocacy can also be lobbying a politician in an attempt to influence legislation. And this is a huge misconception. Lobbying is a type of advocacy, but advocacy, just because you're advocating, doesn't mean you're lobbying, right? So these are the scary words, especially when an organization is a 501c3, which you could definitely do advocacy if you're a 501c3. If you're doing lobbying, my understanding is that a small percentage of what you're doing can be lobbying, but I'm not as versed in those sorts of things. But I know this is the one that folks get confused a lot. So again, lobbying is an example of advocacy, but just because you're advocating does not mean that you are doing lobbying. It's like the square and the rectangle. So I like to think of that as an example. What do you want to know about advocacy? Really setting your goals and being on the same page with your group. I'm going to talk about this a lot more in a minute. Knowing these folks called targets and allies, again, lingo that I'm going to define in a minute. You want to be strategic in what you're doing. Pounding your fists to the table can certainly be a strategy, but if you're going to use something like that, you want to be mindful about that, and it should be a decision that you're, I mean, not always, but I'll talk about that example in just a minute. It can take a long, dedicated effort. In fact, we just had our dog park meet and greet meeting. So I actually have this picture behind me here. It says FOTP loves DFAs, dog-friendly areas. We just had our first ever meet and greet for dog parks, folks who are already in the dog park world, folks who are in the process of getting their dog park finalized, and folks who have not started the process at all but are really, really interested, and they have a core group of people already organized. We just had that meeting, and one of the, we asked the folks that have been around, what's your advice for the newbies on the block? And they said, never, 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 never give up. It took them 6 years to get their dog park. So with that, bringing it back to the main point, it can take a long time to get what you want, right, for your park. It will probably take more than just going to this park district meeting and asking. You might have to develop an advocacy campaign. What does that mean? So it begins with starting to know your goals. And I'm going to have a tool that I'm going to show you in just a minute that will help you figure all these different things out. So knowing your goals as a group, right? Because you might have your own goal, but maybe others in your group are on a different page than you. So really taking the time to be on the same page about what are your goals. You want them to be realistic, achievable, and measurable. You want to know who are your internal, what are your skills as a group? What are your assets, just both in the sense of people and money? We all have different skills and interests and things that we can bring to the table. So figuring out what those are if you don't already know. You want to do a power analysis to understand who are your opponents and allies. Develop a strategy, create the timeline. That might change, right? So maybe you think it's going to take you 4 years to get the field house. You're probably hoping it won't take that long. It took, again, in that example, 6 years to get a dog park. So to get a field house, a huge effort. So maybe you're thinking it might take longer and you're planning on that, but something wonderful happens and you get your field house and it didn't take as long as you expected. So it's an example of creating a timeline, creating a strategy, but being open to those changing. Then creating your action steps and identifying who will do what. So again, I'm gonna have a tool that I'm gonna project in a minute. It's this tool right here. But before I go into that, I want to define these terms. So allies and opponents and targets, influencers, decision makers, right? So these are, these are all people. Allies are the people who might have the same interests as you. They might have some capacity. They can maybe band with you to help give your cause more clout, more visibility, support you in some kind of way. So like Friends of the Parks is an ally, I would think, for your project, whatever you're trying to work on. Opponents, people or groups who are gonna, you might see them putting up some sort of resistance to your cause, right? So knowing who they are should increase your chances of success. And I'm going to talk about something else about this in a second. Targets are the people who have the power to help make the change that you want. There's 2 types of targets. Decision makers are your primary targets. They have the power to make the change. Influencers or agents of change are your secondary targets. They are the folks who might influence the decision makers. So for example, in Chicago, we have aldermen. Aldermen can be decision makers for their ward. Well, who can be an influencer of an alderman? Their staff, right? So sometimes folks think about developing relationships with their alder people, which are great. That's an excellent strategy. But don't forget about the staff. Staff are driving a lot of the work forward as well, doing what the alderman or alderwoman wants them to do. And they can often be really great supporters. The staff and the alderman can both be your allies, right? So another example, sometimes a park supervisor, depending on what you're talking about, can be a decision maker. So can you use a room for an event? In that case, the park supervisor is a decision maker. But maybe if you're talking about, you want your field house expanded or you want the sprinkler fixed, they don't have the decision-making power in that case, but perhaps they can influence, right? They might influence the decision makers. Area managers in those examples would be another example of influencers. Those are folks to know and build relationships with. And in fact, I talk about this a lot more in this How to Find the Right Person webinar, webinar number 5. I want to quickly show the org chart in case you don't know. This is from the Park District summary document that is, again, on that really important budget webpage. So if we're talking about budgeting advocacy, this might be a tool to help you find the right person. And if you want to find out their name, I talk about how to find that name in this webinar, so check that out. All right. Some other things to say, sometimes folks who are an opponent can become your ally. And maybe folks who are your allies can become opponents, right? So it just doesn't mean that these folks are always in one of those roles. I also want to point out this is about people. So allies are people or groups of people. Opponents are people or groups of people. Targets are human beings, right? So like I mentioned, the slamming your fist to the table, right? Like you're really upset about something, someone did something wrong. You might be justified. If you are new in your advocacy campaign, starting off with slamming your fist to the table and having some sort of confrontation might not be the best strategy if you are starting out, because then you might alienate some folks, right? So I mentioned the throwing your fist on the table example because sometimes groups decide that's something you have to do, and that's a decision you have to make for yourself, right? I can't tell you that. No one can tell you that. You as a group have to make that decision. I'm going to talk about actually that too in just a minute. But again, wanted to focus on these are human beings. You're talking to people, not the Chicago Park District. Your target is not the Chicago Park District. It's the human beings who are doing this work and making these decisions, and certainly having relationships with them and communicating with them, being mindful of how you communicate with them can be really important to consider. All right, so let's talk more about tactics and strategies of advocacy. So we talked about presenting testimony at the Board of Commissioners meetings. So as you come on September 17th, suggest maybe, not coming by yourself, right? So having some folks with you, having your pack there, maybe even having the alderman there. Maybe the alderman can't come, they can provide a letter of support. Community organizations can come or provide letters of support, right? So that's a tactic. Let's see. So this is an example of the process that the Park District has laid out for residents of the city to express their requests, their budget requests, right? So these other examples are things that the Park District doesn't necessarily want you to do. But I'm going to go over some little real world examples of these. So here's a picture of the 2017 budget meeting. Might have been the 2016 budget meeting at Fosco Park. Maybe you decide that maybe something has happened that you need to organize a postcard or letter writing campaign, right? So these are examples that you can apply to the budget, this budget lens, right? But maybe this page will make you think of some other issues, like there's a reactionary, something that requires you to react, your group to react, right? That's time sensitive. So I'm thinking of, for example, there were neighbors around Midway Plaisance Park, and they arranged a postcard campaign because they did not want a parking garage built on their park. Email or letter writing campaign. This happened with some stakeholders around Montrose Beach when word came out that there was possibly interest in having a flotation water park thing at the beach, and that did not go so well. So calls to action were created, and both examples, folks made it easy for neighbors to help. So with this postcard Midway Plaisance examples, the postcards were created, the text was created, all folks had to do was sign their name, mail it out. In this example with the letter writing email campaign, the email addresses of the decision makers were shared, and some sample text was provided, right? So thinking about that. Maybe you want to have community meetings. So thinking about, let's see, Kelly Park. They held some community meetings. They did some surveys, not just to educate their neighbors, but to find out what neighbors and park users wanted for their park. So they did a lot of that information. McKinley Park neighbors had a forum recently as word came out that asphalt plant was built kitty corner from the park without anybody knowing, and folks were not happy about that. And it wasn't a confrontational space, but it was tense, but it was also really great. Actually, it was one of the most impressive reactionary forums meetings that I've seen. So those are some examples. So this is escalation strategy is something folks think about when they're asking very nicely. This Humboldt Park Beach example really speaks to that. Folks ask nicely at the Park District Board of Commissioners meetings. And the thing about this story is that there were multiple groups and people involved. So it wasn't just one group, it was all different groups doing they had different strategies and approaches in their advocacy. So keep that in mind. So in this real world example, folks weren't getting what they wanted by asking all nicey, so they arranged a protest outside of the Park District Board of Commissioners meeting. It's the Park District building, if you haven't been, 541 North Fairbanks. And they held that protest. So just to, yeah, so meeting with allies and opponents, right, can be really important. Pitching your story to the local media can be an escalation strategy. I mean, it could really go either way. It doesn't have to be negative because it could be a positive pitch, right? Like maybe you have a local paper and you have a relationship with a journalist there, a reporter there, and they just like to cover the stories of your park. So it could be, you know, your community dreams for a field house, something like that. I'm not very good at pitching stories. So something to consider, like I already said, you can create calls to action, celebrate small wins. So don't just think about building the field house as your only goal. Maybe you have some sort of baby steps and you have small wins that you can celebrate along the way. Make it easy for folks to help. I could talk a lot about this. You know those folks who say, but it was in the email. Well, I mean, just take the 2 seconds to copy and paste what was in the email and resend it out to folks if you want them to help you out, even if it's in their interests as well. And build relationships with people, human beings. Human beings are people. So keep that in mind as well. And if you don't have a relationship with your park supervisor or area manager, I would work on those relationships as well. They're pretty important. And if you have, just to say, if you have a supervisor who you don't have a great relationship with for whatever reason, I've definitely seen a lot of the most successful PACs who, I mean, you know, sometimes people are people and they don't always do great, they're not always doing great work at their job, but sometimes there's just general misunderstanding or some sort of, I don't know, try to be vague here, but sometimes there's something that happens in the beginning that makes a relationship kind of weak. So trying to work on that can be very helpful. All right, so here's the tool I was talking about. So this is something you can just, you know, create on a piece of paper. You can draw out, you can make a nice little Excel table, print it out for your PAC, for your leadership, for whatever group you're on, and begin to fill these things out. This is really important. This first column is super important because you might have a goal in mind. That might be your goal. Maybe the vice president or the treasurer, maybe their goals are not the same as yours. So spending the time to talk about what your long and short-term goals are and being in agreement about that. Because if you're divided, that might bring you down in the future. So you want to be united on this. You want to be on the same page, and maybe maybe you don't like what's produced or what's finalized, but hopefully you've bought into the process. Because again, without being united, that might create resentment, and maybe someone who is an internal resource or asset, someone within the group who might turn into an opponent if something happens. You know, that's how things are. People are people. All right, so resources and assets, identifying, oops, I forgot to say short-term goals. So again, long-term goals should be, you know, think about where you want to be at the end of your campaign, and it should be something attainable and measurable. So I don't want to say, I want a better Gladstone Park. That doesn't mean anything. I want the field house to be open 6-7 days a week, dare I dream. I want it to have, I want it expanded so not everyone's crammed in there when it rains during day camp, which is a challenge that many parks around our city have. I'm sure you guys might relate to that. Your parks supervisors might relate to that. And then again, the short-term goals. So yeah, resources and assets are internal to your group of folks. What skills do you have as people? And then maybe you have some funds available. Support and allies and opponents are external, right? So that's outside of your group. This could be the alderman, could be community organizations, could be some other group that I'm not thinking of, park district, right? Like I mentioned, the supervisor, and they're people. So maybe you're listing the organization, but also try to list the people as well. So who are the decision makers? Actually, that should say decision makers. So who are the decision makers, and then who are the people that might be able to influence the decision makers? Again, this is not about your internal group. And then the strategies and approaches, right? So what do you want to do here? And then action steps, who's going to do it and when. Let me just check real fast the web page. Oops. I think I talked about everything I wanted to. So I did not reinvent the wheel here, folks. Or I did maybe reinvent the wheel. I did not invent the wheel is what I meant to say. A lot of the things that I presented on today were pulled from this toolkit. This is from the University of Kentucky. This is from chapter 30. Some of the things I pulled from there here, including that tool I just showed you, came from somewhere in here, Organizing for Effective Advocacy. This is a great set of resources, leadership and management, developing organizational structure. There's something in here about finding volunteers. It's really great. I suggest check it out in case you don't have it. The links, first time seeing that link and information is right here. And if you don't have my information, again, Nicole Machuca, Director of Environmental Education, Neighborhood Parks. Depending on what hat I'm wearing, I might say Environmental Education or Neighborhood Parks. Give me a call. I am here to be available to help you out. As I like to say, the answer is always no unless you ask. So if you have a question, please give me a call or a request. Be happy to speak with you, brainstorm with you as best I can. If you don't already follow us on our Facebook page, please visit us on Facebook. And of course, here's my email as well. I am available on email. And with that, pretty sure that was everything I wanted to talk about. I'll probably end this and remember 80 billion things. But September 17th, hope to see you there. Hope to see you with a lot of different folks at the meeting. Don't forget, you can bring out a printout of your testimony that you bring pictures, bring people, bring allies, letters of support. Don't let this be, if you have a big goal, it's not just about this public budget hearing, right? This is just one piece of your advocacy strategy. So hope that was helpful, and I will see you soon. Bye.